The morning sun cast long shadows across the Windsor Castle grounds as James Harrison adjusted his red tunic and straightened his bearskin hat. At 35, he had been serving as a Queen's Guard for 3 years, standing motionless for hours at his post, enduring tourists' cameras and the occasional fool who thought it amusing to try making him laugh. What they didn't know, what none of them could possibly guess, was that before donning the ceremonial uniform, James had spent 12 years as one of the most elite soldiers in the British Army. The SAS had been his life from age 21 to 33. 12 years of operations that officially never happened, in places that didn't exist on any map the public ever saw. Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, and half a dozen other locations where British interests required the kind of precision that only the regiment could provide. James had been a sniper, one of the best, with confirmed kills at distances that would make most people's heads spin. His longest confirmed kill was 1,847 meters in the mountains of Afghanistan, a shot that had saved an entire patrol from an ambush. But those days felt like a lifetime ago as he stood at attention outside the castle gates. The transition from special forces to ceremonial duties hadn't been his choice, exactly. A roadside bomb in his final deployment had left him with chronic pain in his left leg and occasional tremors in his hands when he was tired. Not enough to discharge him from service, but enough to end his operational career. The army had offered him various positions, but something about the dignity and honor of protecting the royal family had appealed to him. It was still service, still important, even if it meant standing still instead of moving through hostile territory. The other guards respected James well enough, though few knew about his background. He'd mentioned serving in Afghanistan when directly asked, but he'd learned early on that people made assumptions about guards that weren't always flattering. Many saw them as parade soldiers, ceremonial figures who looked impressive but had never seen real action. It was easier to let people think what they wanted than to correct every misconception. That Tuesday morning started like any other. James had completed his 4-hour shift at the main gate and was heading to the guardroom when Sergeant Collins approached him with an unusual request. "Harrison, you're needed at the staff building. Some visiting officials want to tour our training facilities, and they specifically requested to see our marksmanship capabilities." James nodded, though internally he wondered why he'd been selected. The guard maintained their shooting skills, of course, but it wasn't their primary function. Still, orders were orders. The group of officials turned out to be a mixed bunch: 2 members of parliament, a journalist writing a piece about military readiness, and several senior police officers from London's firearms units. They were being escorted by Colonel Pemberton, the commanding officer of the guard unit, who had the perpetually polished look of someone who'd spent more time in boardrooms than battlefields. "Gentlemen, ladies," the colonel announced as they entered the indoor shooting range beneath the castle complex, "this is our marksmanship training facility. While ceremonial duties are our primary function, we maintain combat readiness as professional soldiers." The range was modern and well-equipped, with targets set at various distances up to 300 meters. Several guards were already present, going through their weekly qualifications with standard-issue SA-80 rifles. The visitors watched with polite interest as the soldiers fired at paper targets, their shots forming respectable groupings. "Quite impressive," commented MP Sarah Richardson, though her tone suggested she was being diplomatic rather than genuinely impressed. "Tell me, Colonel, how do these skills translate to actual combat situations? I mean, standing still and shooting at paper targets is rather different from real operations, isn't it?" The colonel's jaw tightened slightly. "Our personnel are trained soldiers first, ceremonial guards second. Many have operational experience." "If you don't mind me saying," interjected Chief Inspector Williams from the Metropolitan Police Firearms Unit, "but ceremonial duties don't exactly prepare one for the realities of tactical shooting. We see it all the time, soldiers who can hit a bullseye on a range but struggle in dynamic situations." James felt his jaw clench as he listened from his position near the back of the group. The condescending tone was familiar. He'd heard it before from people who assumed that because he now spent his days standing motionless, he'd never faced real danger. The journalist, a thin man named Peterson, was scribbling notes furiously. "Colonel, would it be possible to see a demonstration? Perhaps one of your guards could show us these skills in action?" Colonel Pemberton looked uncomfortable. The guard who'd been shooting had just finished his qualification, scoring respectably but nothing spectacular. The last thing the colonel wanted was for one of his men to underperform in front of these critics. "Certainly," he replied, scanning the room. His eyes landed on James. "Harrison, you're up." James moved forward, accepting the SA-80 rifle from the previous shooter. The weapon felt familiar in his hands, though lighter than the L-96 sniper rifle he'd spent years with in the SAS. He checked the weapon automatically, chamber clear, magazine seated properly, safety engaged. "What would you like to see?" James asked quietly. Chief Inspector Williams stepped forward with a slight smirk. "Well, let's start with the 100-meter target. Standard qualification should be easy enough for an experienced guardsman." There was something in the man's tone that rankled James. Not just doubt, but dismissive certainty that this would be mediocre at best. The other visitors were watching with expressions ranging from polite interest to barely concealed skepticism. "The 100-meter target," Peterson the journalist said, squinting down the range, "that's the one with the smallest bullseye, correct?" "How large is that exactly?" 10 centimeters, replied the colonel. "A good score would be 8 out of 10 shots in the inner ring." "And an excellent score?" asked MP Richardson. "All 10 shots in the bullseye would be exceptional for ceremonial personnel," Chief Inspector Williams answered before the colonel could respond. "Though I suspect we'll see something more typical." James felt the familiar calm descend over him as he moved to the firing position. It was the same mental state he'd entered hundreds of times in operational situations, external noise fading away, breathing slowing, heart rate dropping. He'd learned long ago not to let ego drive his shooting. Every shot had to be perfect because in his old job, missing meant people died. He loaded 10 rounds into the magazine, chambered the first round, and took his position. The stance felt slightly awkward after years of unconventional shooting positions, rooftops, vehicle hoods, hastily constructed hides in hostile territory. The controlled environment of a shooting range was almost luxurious by comparison. The first shot broke cleanly, the report echoing through the enclosed space. Through the scope, James could see the hole appear dead center in the bull's eye. He worked the bolt smoothly, chambering the next round without taking his eye from the scope. The second shot followed immediately, placed less than a centimeter from the first. By the fourth shot, the group of observers had gone quiet. By the eighth shot, they were leaning forward, straining to see the target. When James fired his 10th and final shot, he cleared the weapon and stepped back from the firing line. The target retrieval system hummed as it brought the paper target forward for inspection. The silence stretched for several seconds as everyone stared at the target. All 10 shots had not only hit the bullseye, they had created what appeared to be a single, slightly elongated hole in the exact center of the target. "Jesus Christ," whispered one of the junior officers who'd been observing from the side. Chief Inspector Williams stepped closer to examine the target, his expression shifting from skepticism to bewilderment. "This has to be some kind of mistake. The range equipment must be malfunctioning, or—" "The equipment is fine," Colonel Pemberton said quietly, though he looked as surprised as anyone. "Harrison, where exactly did you serve before joining the Guard?" James hesitated for a moment. He'd spent 3 years deflecting questions about his past, maintaining the fiction that he was just another soldier who'd done his duty and moved on. But something about the dismissive attitude of these visitors, their assumption that ceremonial soldiers were somehow lesser, had awakened something in him that he thought he'd left buried. "Afghanistan, sir. Among other places." "What unit?" The question came from Chief Inspector Williams, whose tone had lost its earlier condescension. 22 SAS, sir. Sniper." The admission hung in the air like smoke from the rifle shots. The journalist's pen had stopped moving. The MPs were staring at James as if seeing him for the first time. Even the colonel looked stunned. "How long?" asked MP Richardson quietly. 12 years, ma'am. From 2009 to 2021. "And your longest confirmed kill?" This from Chief Inspector Williams, who had gone pale. James looked at the man for a long moment. In the old days, he would have deflected the question, classified information and all that. But his service record had been declassified when he transferred to ceremonial duties. 1,847 meters, sir. In Helmand Province, 2019. The number seemed to echo in the suddenly quiet room. To put it in perspective, it meant James had killed an enemy combatant from over a mile away, a shot requiring not just incredible skill, but mathematical precision accounting for wind, temperature, humidity, bullet drop, and a dozen other variables. Good God, breathed Peterson the journalist. That's nearly 2 kilometers. 1.847 kilometers, yes sir, James confirmed. Though that was under ideal conditions with a proper rifle. This, he gestured to the SA-80, is a different animal entirely. Chief Inspector Williams was shaking his head slowly. I owe you an apology, soldier. I made assumptions. No apology necessary, sir, James replied. Most people don't expect to find Special Forces personnel standing guard at tourist attractions. Colonel Pemberton was studying the target again, then looked back at James with new understanding. How many of our guards have operational backgrounds like this? I couldn't say for certain, sir. We don't usually discuss our previous assignments in detail. The truth was, James suspected there were others. He'd noticed things, the way certain guards moved, how they reacted to unexpected sounds, the way their eyes constantly scanned for threats even during routine duties. The military often assigned experienced soldiers to prestigious postings like the Guards, but most kept their backgrounds private. This changes things considerably, MP Richardson said, looking thoughtful. The public perception of the Guards as purely ceremonial. With respect, ma'am, James interrupted gently, the ceremonial aspect is important too. We're protecting symbols that matter to people, representing traditions that go back centuries. The fact that we can also fight when necessary is just insurance. The group began preparing to move on to the next part of their tour, but James could see the shift in their demeanor. The dismissive attitude was gone, replaced by a new respect and, in some cases, what looked like embarrassment at their earlier assumptions. As they filed out of the range, Chief Inspector Williams lingered behind. Harrison, he said quietly, I was out of line earlier. I've seen a lot of trained shooters in my time, police and military both, but what you just did, that's something else entirely. Thank you, sir. Can I ask you something personal? Of course. Why the Guards? I mean, with your background, you could have had your pick of specialized units, training positions, even private security work that pays 10 times what you're making here. James considered the question. It was one he'd asked himself many times during his first year in the Red Tunic. After 12 years of war, sir, I wanted to protect something that represented peace. Standing guard at a palace might look simple from the outside, but it's protecting an idea, stability, continuity, the notion that some things endure even when everything else changes. The chief inspector nodded slowly. That's actually quite profound. Besides, James added with a slight smile, someone has to make sure the tourists don't get too close. As Williams left to catch up with the group, James remained in the shooting range for a few minutes, checking and cleaning the rifle he'd used. The familiar ritual was soothing, a connection to his old life that he rarely allowed himself. The shooting demonstration had been a minor event in the grand scheme of things, but he could already sense that word would spread. In an organization like the Guards, where routine was everything and surprises were rare, news of a sniper in their ranks would travel fast. He wasn't sure how he felt about that. The anonymity had been comfortable, allowing him to blend in and focus on his duties without the weight of expectations. But perhaps it was time for that chapter to end. As he secured the rifle in the armory and headed back to his quarters, James reflected on the morning's events. The looks of surprise and respect from the visitors had been gratifying, certainly, but what struck him most was how natural it had felt to be behind a rifle again, even briefly. The transition from elite soldier to ceremonial guard had been more difficult than he'd admitted to anyone, including himself. Standing motionless for hours while tourists snapped photos was a far cry from the adrenaline-fueled operations that had defined his adult life. But today had reminded him that the skills never really left, they just waited quietly beneath the surface, ready when needed. That evening, as he stood his final shift at the main gate, James noticed Colonel Pemberton approaching with another officer he didn't recognize, a woman in civilian clothes who carried herself with the unmistakable bearing of military intelligence. "Harrison," the colonel said, "I'd like you to meet Major Catherine Walsh. She has some questions about your demonstration today." The woman stepped forward with a firm handshake. "Guardsman Harrison, your reputation precedes you. I represent a department that's very interested in soldiers with your particular skill set." James felt a familiar stirring in his chest, the mixture of anticipation and wariness that came with new operational possibilities. "What kind of department, ma'am?" "The kind that occasionally needs someone who can make impossible shots in circumstances where failure isn't an option." "Are you interested in supplementing your current duties with some consulting work?" As the evening shadows lengthened across the castle grounds, James realized that his quiet life as an anonymous guardsman might be coming to an end. The question was whether he was ready to step back into the shadows he'd worked so hard to leave behind. 3 weeks had passed since the shooting demonstration that had turned James Harrison's quiet life upside down. Word had indeed traveled through the Guards regiment faster than a London fog, and, suddenly, everyone seemed to know about the sniper in their midst. Some of his fellow guardsmen looked at him with new respect, others with curiosity, and a few with the kind of wariness reserved for those who'd seen too much action. The most significant change, however, came from Major Catherine Walsh's offer. She represented a joint task force that operated in the gray areas between military intelligence, counterterrorism, and diplomatic security. They needed someone with James's particular skills for what she described as delicate situations requiring surgical precision. James had accepted, partly because the additional income would help him support his aging mother in Yorkshire, but mostly because standing at attention for 4 hours at a stretch had begun to feel like a prison sentence. The consulting work would allow him to use his skills without fully abandoning his commitment to the Guards. His first assignment had come with a classified briefing folder and instructions to report to a nondescript office building near Victoria Station. The target was an arms dealer named Viktor Kozlov, a former Russian military officer who'd gone private after the Soviet collapse. Intelligence suggested Kozlov was planning to sell advanced shoulder-fired missiles to a terrorist cell operating in Western Europe. The problem was proving it. Kozlov was careful, paranoid, and had enough legitimate business ventures to provide cover for his illegal activities. Traditional surveillance had failed to penetrate his security, and intercepted communications were too vague to provide actionable intelligence. What they needed was someone who could observe from a distance, document the transaction when it happened, and, if necessary, prevent the weapons from reaching their intended buyers. Someone who could remain undetected at ranges that would make normal surveillance impossible. The operation had required James to take a week's leave from his guard duties, officially for family reasons. In reality, he'd spent 6 days lying motionless in a camouflaged hide on a rooftop in Antwerp, watching Kozlov's warehouse through a high-powered scope. The waiting had been the hardest part. In Afghanistan, surveillance operations usually lasted hours or at most a day or two. This assignment required the patience of a monk and the stillness of a statue, qualities he'd honed during his ceremonial duties but tested to their limits in a hostile urban environment. On the 6th day, Kozlov had finally made his move. A truck had arrived at the warehouse after midnight, followed by a van containing 3 men whose photographs James recognized from intelligence briefings as known terrorists. Through his scope, he'd watched the transaction unfold, documenting everything with a camera equipped with a telephoto lens that could resolve individual faces at 800 meters. When one of the terrorists had begun examining the missiles, pointing them toward civilian buildings as if testing targeting options, James had been forced to make a decision. The intelligence value of the operation was enormous, but allowing advanced weapons to leave with known terrorists was unacceptable. His shot had been taken from 743 meters, through an open window, in a crosswind, at a target partially obscured by warehouse equipment. The bullet had struck the lead terrorist in the chest, killing him instantly and causing the others to scatter. In the confusion, Belgian special forces had moved in to secure the scene, arresting Kozlov and confiscating enough evidence to dismantle his entire network. The success of the Antwerp operation had led to others. A human trafficking coordinator eliminated during a supposed vacation in the French countryside. A weapons cache discovered after James had spent 3 days observing a seemingly abandoned factory in Eastern Europe. Each mission had been justified by intelligence agencies as necessary to prevent larger catastrophes, and James had found himself drawn back into the world he thought he'd left behind. The irony wasn't lost on him. By day, he stood motionless outside Buckingham Palace, a living symbol of British stability and tradition. By night, he operated in the shadows, conducting missions that officially didn't exist to protect that same stability from threats the public would never know about. The double life had begun to take its toll. James found himself constantly scanning crowds for threats even during routine guard duties, his sniper's instincts refusing to switch off. The chronic pain in his leg had worsened from the strain of lying motionless for extended periods during surveillance operations, and the tremors in his hands had become more frequent. Worse was the isolation. He couldn't discuss the consulting work with his fellow guardsmen, couldn't share the burden of decisions made in life-or-death situations. The brotherhood he'd experienced in the SAS was absent from both his ceremonial duties and his secret operations. The breaking point came during what should have been a routine assignment. James had been tasked with observing a suspected terrorist cell in Manchester, providing overwatch for an MI5 operation. The intelligence had suggested a simple surveillance job: document the suspect's activities and provide early warning if they attempted to leave their safe house. But intelligence was wrong more often than people liked to admit. James had been positioned on a rooftop 400 meters from the target building when the operation went sideways. The MI5 team had moved in for what they thought was a routine arrest, only to discover that the suspects had been expecting them. The safe house had been booby-trapped, and the first officer through the door had triggered an explosion that brought down half the building. Through his scope, James had watched in horror as the remaining suspects opened fire on the MI5 team with automatic weapons. 3 officers were down, possibly dead, and the others were pinned behind their vehicles with no cover and no way to retreat. The terrorists had positioned themselves perfectly, using the rubble of the collapsed building as cover while maintaining clear fields of fire on the street. They were systematically working their way around the MI5 position, and it was only a matter of minutes before they would have clear shots at the trapped officers. James had radioed for permission to engage, but the response had been immediate and uncompromising: observe only, do not compromise your position, wait for backup. The bureaucratic response to a battlefield situation had filled him with the same rage he'd felt years earlier when politicians made tactical decisions from comfortable offices. The first MI5 officer had died while James waited for authorization that never came. Then, the second. By the time backup arrived 20 minutes later, 5 good people were dead because someone in a distant command center had been more concerned with maintaining plausible deniability than saving lives. That night, James had sat in his small flat near the castle, staring at the wall and questioning every choice that had brought him to this point. He joined the army to serve his country, trained with the SAS to protect the innocent, and taken the consulting work to use his skills for a greater good. But, somehow, those noble intentions had led him to a rooftop watching good people die while he followed orders to do nothing. The official debrief had been a masterpiece of bureaucratic doublespeak. The operation had been classified as a partial success because valuable intelligence had been gathered about the terrorists' network. The 5 dead officers were described as having made the ultimate sacrifice in service to their country, as if their deaths had been inevitable rather than preventable. James had submitted his report and requested reassignment to normal guard duties only. Major Walsh had tried to convince him to reconsider, emphasizing how valuable his skills were to national security, but James had been firm. He was done with the shadow world. Returning to full-time ceremonial duties had felt like stepping into a different universe. The problems of tourists wanting to take selfies with him seemed almost absurdly simple after spending weeks dealing with international arms dealers and terrorist cells. The routine of standing guard, which had once felt restrictive, now felt liberating in its clarity and purpose. But peace had a way of being temporary in James Harrison's life. The call had come on a Tuesday morning while he was preparing for his shift at St. James's Palace. Colonel Pemberton's voice on the phone had been unusually tense. "Harrison, I need you in my office immediately. We have a situation." The situation, it turned out, was a credible threat against the royal family. Intelligence services had intercepted communications suggesting an assassination attempt during an upcoming public appearance. The threat was specific enough to be taken seriously but vague enough to make traditional security measures difficult to implement. The problem, Colonel Pemberton explained as James stood at attention in his office, is that we can't simply cancel the engagement. It's a charity event for wounded veterans, and canceling would send the wrong message about our ability to protect our own people. The event was scheduled for the following week at a large outdoor venue in central London. Thousands of people would attend, including many veterans and their families. The security challenges were enormous: too many potential shooting positions, too many variables, too many ways for a determined assassin to get close to their target. What do the regular security services recommend? James asked. They want to turn the entire event into an armed camp. Metal detectors, armed police every 50 meters, snipers on every rooftop, helicopter surveillance. The whole 9 yards. James could see the problem immediately. Veterans who'd served in combat zones didn't need reminders of warfare at what was supposed to be a celebration of their service. The heavy security presence would transform a positive event into something that felt like a military operation. There has to be a better way, he said. Colonel Pemberton nodded grimly. Which brings us to why you're here. Major Walsh contacted me this morning. She believes that the best security is invisible security, and she's asked specifically for you. James felt his stomach tighten. He'd made it clear that he was finished with the consulting work, but, apparently, the work wasn't finished with him. What exactly is she proposing, sir? A minimal visible security presence, but, with you providing overwatch from a concealed position. If there is an attempt on the royal family, you would be the last line of defense. The weight of that responsibility settled on James's shoulders like a familiar burden. Protecting the royal family was exactly what he'd signed up for when he joined the Guards, but this was different. This wasn't standing at attention while tourists took photos. This was accepting sole responsibility for preventing an assassination in front of thousands of witnesses. Sir, with respect, wouldn't a team of snipers be more appropriate? Multiple observation points, overlapping fields of fire? Under normal circumstances, yes. But, the intelligence suggests the assassin has inside knowledge of standard security procedures. Multiple sniper positions would be too obvious, too easy to identify and counter. What we need is someone who can remain undetected while maintaining coverage of the entire venue. James understood the logic, even as he dreaded the implications. A team of snipers would be spotted by anyone with basic training in counter-surveillance. But, a single shooter, properly concealed and positioned, could remain invisible until it was too late for an attacker to adjust their plans. What's the timeline, sir? You have 6 days to survey the venue, identify the optimal position, and prepare your equipment. The event is next Sunday afternoon. 6 days to plan for what could be the most important shot of his life, not to take a life, but to preserve one. The irony would have been amusing if the stakes weren't so high. Sir, I'll need complete architectural plans for every building within rifle range of the venue. Weather forecasts, crowd management details, emergency evacuation routes. And, I'll need to coordinate with whoever is handling communications for the security team. Colonel Pemberton smiled for the first time during their conversation. I'll have everything you need within the hour. Major Walsh said you'd know exactly what to ask for. As James left the colonel's office to prepare for what might be his most challenging assignment, he reflected on how dramatically his life had changed since that morning at the shooting range. 3 months ago, he'd been an anonymous guardsman whose biggest concern was avoiding tourists' cameras. Now he was preparing to single-handedly protect the monarchy from assassination. The transformation was complete, but James couldn't shake the feeling that the most difficult part was yet to come. The Veterans Charity event was held at Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park in Stratford, a sprawling complex that had been transformed from Olympic venues into community spaces. The main ceremony would take place in an open amphitheater area that could accommodate several thousand people, surrounded by parkland and overlooked by several tall buildings. James had spent the previous 5 days conducting the most thorough reconnaissance of his career. He'd walked every meter of the venue, studied architectural plans until he could navigate the area blindfolded, and identified 17 potential shooting positions that an assassin might use. More importantly, he'd found the one position that would allow him to cover all 17 while remaining completely invisible to both the crowd and any potential threat. The building was a maintenance facility on the edge of the park, officially closed to the public but accessible through service tunnels that connected to the old Olympic infrastructure. The roof provided an unobstructed view of the entire venue at a distance of 623 meters, close enough for precision shooting but far enough to remain undetectable. James had arrived at his position 4 hours before the event, well before dawn on Sunday morning. He'd brought minimal equipment, his personal L96 sniper rifle, a weapon he'd purchased legally after leaving the SAS and had modified to his exact specifications, along with enough ammunition for any conceivable scenario and a communications kit that would keep him connected to the security team. The waiting had begun immediately. James settled into his hide, a carefully constructed shelter of camouflage netting and urban debris that made him effectively invisible from any angle. The rifle was positioned on a custom bipod that allowed for minute adjustments while maintaining perfect stability. Through his scope, James could see the venue coming to life as event staff arrived to make final preparations. The stage where the royal family would speak was clearly visible, as were the VIP seating areas and the main crowd sections. Every potential shooting position he'd identified was within his field of view. At 0800 hours, the advanced security team arrived. James watched through his scope as plainclothes officers took their positions throughout the crowd areas. They were good, but not invisible. Anyone with training would be able to identify them within minutes. That was intentional. The visible security was meant to deter amateur threats and provide a psychological barrier. The real protection would come from James if deterrence failed. At 1000 hours, the first attendees began arriving. Veterans in wheelchairs, walking with canes, some missing limbs, others bearing invisible wounds that showed only in their careful movements and watchful eyes. Many brought family members, wives, children, parents who'd waited anxiously through deployments and welcomed home-changed soldiers. James felt a familiar tightness in his chest as he watched them gather. These were his people, men and women who'd served and sacrificed for their country. The idea that someone would target them or use their gathering as an opportunity to attack the royal family filled him with a cold anger that he'd learned to channel into focus. By noon, nearly 3,000 people had assembled in the amphitheater. The crowd was a mix of veterans from various conflicts, some elderly men from the Falklands, middle-aged soldiers from Iraq and Afghanistan, younger veterans from more recent operations. Their families created a sea of faces that represented generations of British military service. At 1245 hours, James spotted the first anomaly. A man in his 30s had positioned himself near the back of the crowd, but, unlike everyone else, he wasn't focused on the stage. Instead, he was systematically scanning the surrounding buildings with what appeared to be a small pair of binoculars. His movements were subtle but purposeful, and he'd chosen a position that gave him an excellent view of potential sniper locations. James adjusted his scope's focus and studied the man carefully. Medium height, athletic build, short dark hair. He wore casual civilian clothes that wouldn't attract attention, but something about his posture and movements suggested military training. More concerning was the small earpiece partially concealed by his hair and what appeared to be the outline of a concealed weapon beneath his jacket. "Control, this is Overwatch," James whispered into his throat microphone. "I have a possible hostile in Section C, grid reference Charlie 74. Male, 30 to 35 years, dark hair, blue jacket, conducting counter-surveillance of elevated positions." The response came immediately from the Security Coordination Center. "Overwatch, Control. We'll have plainclothes officers move to investigate. Maintain observation." James watched as two security officers began working their way through the crowd toward the suspect's position. They were being subtle, but the man with the binoculars noticed them immediately. Instead of panicking or attempting to flee, he simply melted back into the crowd and disappeared from view. That level of situational awareness and crowd movement suggested professional training. Either they were dealing with a very sophisticated threat, or James had just identified a member of a hostile surveillance team. "Control, suspect has gone mobile and is now out of sight. Be advised, this individual demonstrates professional-level counter-surveillance capabilities. At 1,300 hours, the royal motorcade arrived. James watched through his scope as the vehicles pulled up to the VIP entrance, their occupants protected by a carefully coordinated security screen. The prince and princess emerged and were quickly escorted toward the backstage area, but not before James had confirmed their location and adjusted his primary firing solution. The ceremony began 15 minutes later with speeches from military charity representatives and veteran advocates. James maintained his scan pattern, systematically checking each potential threat location while keeping his primary focus on the stage area. His rifle remained trained on the center of the platform, ready to engage any threat that emerged. 20 minutes into the ceremony, James spotted movement in a window of the office building 400 meters to his northeast. The glint of sunlight on glass had caught his attention, but, as he adjusted his scope's magnification, he could see it wasn't a reflection. Someone was positioned in that window with what appeared to be a rifle. Control, this is Overwatch. Confirmed hostile shooter in the Meridian office building, 7th floor, 3rd window from the north corner. I repeat, confirmed hostile with rifle. The response was immediate. Overwatch, Control. You are cleared to engage. Neutralize the threat. James made rapid calculations in his head. Distance, 847 meters. Wind, slight crosswind from the southwest. Target, partially concealed, moving intermittently. The shot was challenging but, well within his capabilities. He adjusted his scope and settled into his firing position. Through the crosshairs, he could see the assassin more clearly now, the man from the crowd who'd been conducting surveillance earlier. He'd somehow gained access to the office building and was in the process of setting up what appeared to be a high-powered rifle aimed directly at the stage. James controlled his breathing, feeling his heart rate slow as his body entered the familiar state of sniper consciousness. The external world faded away until there was only the target, the crosshairs, and the mathematical certainty of ballistics. The assassin was adjusting his scope, preparing for his own shot. James could see that the rifle was aimed at the podium where the prince was currently speaking. In a few seconds, the would-be killer would be ready to fire. James squeezed the trigger with the smooth, gradual pressure that had been drilled into him through thousands of hours of training. The rifle bucked against his shoulder, the report echoing across the park but lost in the noise of the crowd and the public address system. Through his scope, James saw the assassin jerk backward and disappear from the window. The threat had been neutralized, but James maintained his position, scanning for additional shooters. Professional assassination attempts often involved multiple shooters as backup. Control, this is Overwatch. Target is down. Continuing to scan for additional threats. Overwatch, Control. Well done. We're dispatching teams to secure the building. Maintain your position until we can confirm the area is clear. For the next 30 minutes, James continued his overwatch while police and security teams swarmed the office building. The ceremony continued below, the attendees completely unaware that an assassination attempt had just been thwarted. The prince completed his speech, presenting awards to several veterans and their families. Finally, the all-clear came through his earpiece. Overwatch, Control. Building is secure. Suspect is deceased, no additional threats identified. You're cleared to extract. James began breaking down his position, carefully packing his equipment while maintaining situational awareness. The shot had been clean and precise, a single round to the center of mass that had instantly neutralized the threat without risking collateral damage to anyone in the surrounding buildings. As he prepared to leave his hide, James reflected on the events of the day. Once again, he'd been forced to take a life to protect others, but this time felt different. This wasn't about geopolitics or intelligence operations. This was about protecting people who'd already sacrificed for their country, and a royal family that represented the continuity and stability that made such service meaningful. The extraction from the building was as carefully planned as everything else. James made his way through the service tunnels and emerged through a maintenance entrance several blocks away from the venue. A plain sedan was waiting for him, driven by one of Major Walsh's people. Good work today, the driver said as they pulled away from the area. Initial investigation suggests the shooter was part of a larger cell, but you eliminated their primary asset.
James nodded but didn't respond.
He was already thinking about the debrief that would follow, the paperwork that would reduce the day's events to clinical terminology, and the return to his normal duties as a ceremonial guard. But something had changed during those hours on the rooftop. For the first time since joining the guards, James felt that his two roles, ceremonial protector and operational soldier, had truly merged into something meaningful. He wasn't just performing duties, he was fulfilling a calling. The following morning, James stood at his usual post outside Buckingham Palace, wearing his red tunic and bearskin hat as if nothing had happened. Tourists snapped photos and children waved at him, completely unaware that the man standing motionless before them had prevented a national tragedy less than 24 hours earlier. Colonel Pemberton appeared shortly after the changing of the guard ceremony.
"Harrison, a word?"
They walked to a quiet area away from the tourist crowds, where the colonel stopped and turned to face him.
"I've received the after-action reports from yesterday. Outstanding work. But I need to ask you something directly. Are you prepared to continue this kind of assignment when necessary?" James considered the question carefully.
The consulting work had taken him away from the simple dignity of ceremonial duties and plunged him back into a world of violence and moral complexity. But yesterday had shown him that sometimes the two roles were inseparable. "Sir, I believe my duty is to protect what these ceremonies represent, whether that means standing at attention for tourists or lying on a rooftop with a rifle.
If you need me to continue the consulting work, I'm prepared to do so."
Colonel Pemberton nodded with satisfaction.
"Good man.
There's one more thing. Major Walsh has recommended you for a commendation, but it would have to remain classified indefinitely. No public recognition, no ceremony, just a notation in your file that very few people will ever see."
James almost smiled.
After 12 years in the SAS and 3 years as a guardsman, he'd grown accustomed to doing important work that would never be publicly acknowledged. The satisfaction came from knowing that the work mattered, not from external recognition.
"That's fine, sir. I didn't join the army for the medals. I know. That's exactly why you deserve them."
As James returned to his post, he reflected on how much his life had changed since that shooting demonstration 6 months earlier. He'd gone from anonymous guardsman to covert operative, from standing motionless to taking decisive action, from protecting symbols to protecting lives. The red tunic and bearskin hat remained the same, but the man wearing them had found a new understanding of what service truly meant. Sometimes protecting tradition required breaking it, and sometimes the best way to honor the past was to ensure there would be a future worth protecting. Standing at attention as the afternoon crowds gathered, James Harrison had finally found peace with his dual identity. He was a guardsman and a warrior, a protector of ceremonies and a defender against shadows.
The contradiction no longer troubled him because he understood that both roles served the same fundamental purpose.
The tourists continued taking their photos, unaware that their smiling, motionless subject had just saved a member of the royal family from assassination.
But that was exactly as it should be.
The best protection was invisible, and the greatest service was often the kind that could never be acknowledged. As the sun set over London, James prepared for another night shift at the palace, ready for whatever challenges might emerge from the darkness. 6 months after the assassination attempt at the Veterans Charity event, James Harrison's life had settled into a rhythm that somehow balanced the mundane with the extraordinary. By day, he continued his duties as a Queen's Guard, standing at attention while tourists photographed him and children tried to make him smile. By night, he might find himself on a rooftop in Eastern Europe, tracking arms dealers through a high-powered scope. The dual existence had become natural to him, each role informing and strengthening the other. The patience and discipline required for ceremonial duties had made him an even better sniper, while the tactical awareness from field operations had sharpened his protective instincts during routine guard duty. He'd learned to see threats in tourist crowds, to read body language through the lens of operational experience, and to remain alert even during the most tedious ceremonial functions. Major Walsh had been true to her word about the work being selective and meaningful. James had participated in 7 operations since the Veterans event, each one carefully chosen to match his specific skills and ethical standards. A corrupt weapons inspector eliminated before he could approve sales to terrorist organizations. A human trafficking coordinator whose death had freed dozens of victims. A cyber terrorist whose planned attack on London's power grid had been permanently cancelled by a bullet from 950 meters away. Each mission had been justified not just by strategic necessity, but by clear moral imperatives. James was no longer simply a tool of intelligence agencies, he'd become something more selective and, more dangerous, a precision instrument used only when the stakes were highest and the alternatives had been exhausted. The arrangement had worked well until the morning Colonel Pemberton called him into his office with an expression James had learned to recognize as deeply troubled.
"Harrison, we have a problem. A significant one." James stood at attention, waiting for details he suspected he wouldn't like.
3 days ago, British intelligence intercepted communications suggesting an imminent terrorist attack on London.
The target appears to be the state opening of Parliament next week.
The state opening was one of the most important ceremonial events in the British calendar, when the Queen would formally open a new session of Parliament with ancient rituals that dated back centuries. It combined massive crowds, extensive media coverage, and the presence of virtually every important political figure in the country.
"What kind of attack are they planning, sir?" "That's the problem, we don't know."
The intercepts were fragmentary, suggesting someone with serious capabilities but using sophisticated encryption and coded language. What we do know is that it involves a group with access to military-grade weapons and the skills to use them effectively. James could see where this was heading.
The state opening would involve security measures that made normal protective operations look simple.
Every building within rifle range would be checked and secured.
Counter-sniper teams would be positioned on multiple rooftops.
The entire area would be saturated with surveillance technology and armed personnel. Sir, with that level of security, any conventional attack would be suicide.
What makes them think someone would attempt it? Because the intercepts suggest the attackers have inside knowledge of our security procedures.
They know where our people will be positioned, how our communications work, possibly even our contingency plans. The implications hit James like cold water. An inside source meant that traditional security measures might not just be ineffective, they could be actively compromised.
Every sniper position could be known in advance. Every escape route could be monitored. Every protective measure could be turned into a vulnerability. "What are you asking me to do, sir?"
Colonel Pemberton handed him a sealed folder.
"Major Walsh has developed a plan that doesn't rely on traditional security protocols.
She wants you to provide overwatch for the entire ceremony from a position that won't be in any official security plan."
James opened the folder and reviewed the operational details.
The proposed position was audacious, the bell tower of Westminster Abbey, nearly 800 meters from the Houses of Parliament but with a clear line of sight to the entire ceremonial route. It was far enough away to be outside normal security perimeters, but close enough for accurate shooting with the right equipment. "This is basically asking me to serve as a one-man backup security force for the most important government ceremony of the year."
"Yes. If the main security operation is compromised, you'll be the only protective asset they don't know about." The weight of that responsibility was staggering.
The state opening involved not just the Queen, but the Prime Minister, the entire cabinet, the opposition leadership, senior judges, military commanders, and hundreds of other officials who represented the functioning core of British democracy.
"Sir, what if I'm not enough? What if there are multiple attack teams, or if they're using tactics I can't counter from a single position? Then, we'll have tried everything possible and failed honorably."
"But Major Walsh believes that your record suggests you won't fail."
James spent the next hour reviewing intelligence reports and attack scenarios.
The terrorist group appeared to be a sophisticated cell with connections to several international networks. They had access to advanced weapons, possibly including anti-material rifles capable of defeating standard vehicle armor. More troubling was evidence suggesting they'd been planning this operation for months, conducting surveillance and gathering intelligence on security procedures. The morning of the state opening dawned grey and drizzly, typical London weather that would provide excellent concealment for James's position but also reduce visibility for long-range shooting. He'd been in the bell tower of Westminster Abbey since before sunrise, having gained access through maintenance tunnels that connected to the old medieval foundations.
His equipment for this operation was the most advanced he'd ever used. In addition to his modified L96 rifle, he carried a backup weapon system and enough ammunition for an extended engagement. Communications equipment kept him connected to multiple security frequencies, allowing him to monitor the entire protective operation in real time. The view from the bell tower was spectacular and terrifying in equal measure. James could see the entire ceremonial route from Buckingham Palace to the Houses of Parliament, including all the major crowd areas where thousands of spectators would gather. Through his scope, he could identify security positions, vehicle checkpoints, and crowd control barriers that represented months of planning by hundreds of professionals. At 0800 hours, the first crowds began assembling along the ceremonial route. James systematically scanned each group, looking for anomalies that might indicate hostile surveillance or preparation for attack. His years of experience in crowd assessment served him well. Most people moved and behaved in predictable ways, making it easier to spot those who didn't belong. By 1000 hours, the security apparatus was fully deployed. James could see counter-sniper teams on rooftops, plainclothes officers positioned throughout the crowds, and armed response units stationed at key intersections. It was an impressive display of protective capability, but James couldn't shake the feeling that they were preparing to fight the last war while their enemies planned something entirely different. The first indication that something was wrong came at 1030 hours, 30 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin. All stations, this is Control. We have reports of a suspicious package near the south entrance to Westminster Hall. Bomb disposal is responding. James adjusted his scope to observe the area in question. Through the crosshairs, he could see security personnel cordoning off a section near the Houses of Parliament while specialists in protective gear approached what appeared to be an abandoned briefcase. But something felt wrong about the timing and placement. The package was positioned to draw security resources away from other areas, and James had learned to be suspicious of convenient diversions during high-stakes operations. Control, this is Overwatch. I recommend maintaining full security posture in all other sectors. This feels like a diversion tactic. The response was immediate. Overwatch, acknowledged. All stations maintain current positions while bomb disposal investigates. James continued his systematic scan of the area, paying particular attention to locations that would provide good shooting positions if someone wanted to exploit the distraction. That was when he spotted them. 3 men on the roof of a building 600 meters southeast of his position, clearly visible through his scope as they assembled what appeared to be a large rifle. The weapon they were setting up was massive, far larger than anything a conventional sniper would use. James recognized it immediately as an anti-material rifle, designed to destroy vehicles and equipment rather than target individual personnel. With the right ammunition, such a weapon could penetrate the armor of the royal vehicles or cause catastrophic damage to the ceremonial carriage. Control, this is Overwatch. I have eyes on 3 hostiles with an anti-material rifle on the roof of the Metropolitan Building, approximately 600 meters southeast of Parliament. They appear to be preparing to engage the ceremonial procession. Overwatch, Control. We're sending teams to investigate, but they're 15 minutes out. Can you engage? James was already calculating the shot. Distance, 823 meters. Wind, variable, gusting from the southwest. Target, 3 men in an elevated position with limited cover. The challenge wasn't just the range, it was the need to neutralize all 3 targets before they could complete their preparation or alert other team members who might be positioned elsewhere. Control, I can engage, but I need clarification on rules of engagement. These are confirmed hostiles with weapons capable of defeating vehicle armor. Overwatch, you are cleared to engage with extreme prejudice. Neutralize all targets. James settled into his firing position and began the mental calculations that would determine success or failure. The first shot had to be perfect, not just accurate, but timed to prevent the other 2 from completing their setup or escaping to execute their attack from another position. Through his scope, he could see the lead terrorist making final adjustments to the massive rifle while his companions handled ammunition and communications equipment. They were professionals, moving with the efficiency of a well-trained team, but they'd made one crucial mistake: they'd assumed their position was secure because it wasn't visible from ground level. James controlled his breathing and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against his shoulder, and 823 meters away, the lead terrorist dropped without warning. The other two men spun around, trying to identify the source of the shot, but James was already chambering his second round. The second shot took the communications specialist in the chest, dropping him beside the anti-material rifle. The third man abandoned the weapon and ran toward the roof access, but he was moving in a straight line across open ground with no cover. James's third shot ended the threat permanently. Control, this is Overwatch. 3 targets neutralized. Recommend immediate investigation of that position and search for additional team members. Outstanding work, Overwatch. Teams are moving to secure the building now. But James wasn't finished. Professional terrorist cells didn't rely on single attack teams, especially for operations of this magnitude. He continued scanning potential shooting positions, looking for backup teams or alternative attack vectors. 20 minutes later, he found them. A van had positioned itself near the crowd control barriers along the ceremonial route, but unlike other vehicles in the area, this one had modifications that caught James's attention. The rear doors had been reinforced, and there were small holes cut in the sides that could accommodate rifle barrels. As James watched through his scope, the van's rear doors opened slightly, revealing armed men inside. They were positioning themselves to fire into the crowd when the royal procession passed, creating maximum casualties and chaos while targeting the ceremony's participants. Control, this is Overwatch. I have a vehicle-based attack team positioned along the ceremonial route, grid reference Bravo 47. Multiple armed subjects preparing to engage the procession from inside a modified van. Overwatch, ground teams are responding, but they're 8 minutes out. The procession will pass that location in 6 minutes. James found himself facing an impossible shot. The van was 1,100 meters away, and the targets were partially concealed inside the vehicle. Worse, any missed shots could endanger innocent civilians in the crowd areas. But allowing the attack to proceed would result in dozens of deaths and the potential assassination of members of the royal family. James made rapid calculations for what would be the most challenging shots of his career. He needed to disable the van's occupants through the small openings they'd cut in the vehicle's sides, at a range that pushed the absolute limits of his equipment and skills. The first shot was aimed at the van's fuel tank, hoping to disable the vehicle and force its occupants into the open. The bullet struck exactly where intended, and fuel began pouring onto the street. But the terrorists inside continued their preparations, apparently willing to risk fire rather than abandon their mission. James's second shot went through one of the rifle ports, striking an armed man who'd been positioning himself to fire into the crowd. The impact caused the others inside to shift their positions, giving James clearer shots at their locations. The third and fourth shots eliminated the remaining threats, leaving the van disabled and its occupants neutralized just as the royal procession came into view around the corner. Control, this is Overwatch. Vehicle-based threat neutralized. Recommend immediate scene security and medical response. Overwatch, outstanding work. All threats have been eliminated, and the ceremony will proceed as planned. From his position in the bell tower, James watched as the state opening ceremony unfolded exactly as it had for centuries. The Queen's carriage proceeded along the ceremonial route, past crowds of cheering spectators who would never know how close they'd come to witnessing a massacre. The ancient rituals continued in the Houses of Parliament, where democracy's representatives would gather under the protection that James and others had provided. As the ceremony concluded and the crowds dispersed, James began packing his equipment. The day's events would be classified at the highest levels, reduced to sanitized reports that would never capture the reality of what had happened. The terrorist threat would be attributed to ongoing security operations that had successfully prevented an incident. But, for James, the day represented something more significant than another successful mission. Standing in that bell tower, protecting a ceremony that embodied centuries of British tradition and democratic values, he'd finally understood what service truly meant. It wasn't about personal recognition or career advancement. It was about preserving something larger than yourself, something worth protecting even at the cost of your own life.
3 days later, James stood at his usual post outside Buckingham Palace, wearing his red tunic and bearskin hat as tourists took their photographs. Colonel Pemberton approached during the changing of the guard ceremony, stopping beside him as the relief guards took their positions.
"Harrison, I have something for you."
He handed James a small box containing a medal unlike any James had ever seen. It was beautifully crafted but bore no identifying marks, no inscription, no indication of what it represented or who had authorized it.
"What is this, sir?"
"Recognition for services that cannot be officially acknowledged, from people whose names you'll never know, for actions that officially never happened."
James examined the medal carefully. It was elegant in its simplicity, significant in its anonymity.
"Sir, I'm honored, but I was just doing my duty."
"That's exactly why you deserve it."
"The best soldiers never serve for recognition, but that doesn't mean their service should go unrecognized entirely." As Colonel Pemberton walked away, James reflected on the strange path that had brought him to this point. He joined the army as a young man seeking adventure and purpose. The SAS had given him skills and experiences that most people couldn't imagine. The guards had taught him patience and the value of tradition. But it was the combination of all three, the warrior, the guardian, and the protector, that had made him into something unique. He was living proof that some people were called to serve in ways that couldn't be easily categorized or publicly celebrated. That evening, as James prepared for another night shift at the palace, he received a final visit from Major Walsh. "James, I wanted to thank you personally for your work over the past year. You've exceeded every expectation and probably saved more lives than we'll ever be able to calculate."
"Thank you, ma'am. Will there be more assignments?" Major Walsh smiled.
"There will always be threats that require someone with your particular skills. The question is whether you're prepared to continue this kind of work indefinitely."
James considered the question carefully. A year ago, he would have said no without hesitation. The weight of constant vigilance, the isolation of classified operations, and the moral complexity of making life and death decisions had seemed like burdens he'd already carried long enough. But now he understood that some burdens were also privileges. Not everyone was capable of standing between innocent people and those who would harm them. Not everyone had the skills, training, and temperament to serve as a last line of defense when all other protections failed. "Ma'am, as long as there are people worth protecting and threats worth stopping, I'll be ready." "I was hoping you'd say that."
"Rest well, James.
Something tells me we'll be calling on you again soon."
As Major Walsh disappeared into the London evening, James Harrison adjusted his red tunic and prepared to stand guard over a palace that represented everything he'd sworn to protect. He was a Queen's Guard and a covert operative, a ceremonial soldier and a lethal weapon, a protector of tradition and a guardian of the future. The tourists would continue taking their photographs, never knowing that the motionless figure in the red coat was one of the most dangerous men in Britain. The crowds would smile and wave at what they saw as a quaint ceremonial figure, unaware that he could kill a target at over a kilometer away.
And James wouldn't have it any other way.
In a world where threats evolved constantly and enemies grew more sophisticated with each passing year, democracy and freedom needed guardians who could evolve as well. Sometimes that meant standing perfectly still while children pointed and laughed. Sometimes it meant lying motionless on a rooftop for days, waiting for one perfect shot. Both roles required the same fundamental qualities: unwavering dedication, absolute reliability, and the willingness to sacrifice personal comfort for a greater good.
James Harrison had found peace with the contradiction because he understood that both versions of service served the same ultimate purpose.
Standing at his post as another day ended in London, James reflected on how much he'd changed since that morning at the shooting range when his secret had been revealed. He was still the same man who'd served 12 years with the SAS, but he'd become something more: a guardian of the guardians, a protector of the protectors, a last line of defense for everything that made civilization worth preserving. The red tunic and bearskin hat remained symbols of ancient tradition, but the man wearing them had become a very modern kind of warrior. And, in a world where threats came from shadows and struck without warning, perhaps that was exactly what the times required. As the palace lights came on and London settled into another peaceful evening, James Harrison stood ready for whatever challenges might emerge from the darkness, secure in the knowledge that some things were worth any sacrifice to preserve.